Episode number 72 of the Monday Morning Worship Leader. Nadab, Abihu, and the Regulative Principle.
Praise God from whom all blessings flow. Praise Him, all creatures give His glory. Praise Him above the heavenly host. Praise Father, Son, and Holy Ghost.
Well, hey guys, it's Brother John here. So good to be with you on the podcast today. And if you hear a moan and groan in the background, it's because my air conditioning is running 24/7 right now as we are enjoying 96, 97-degree days here in St. Louis, Missouri. I'm John Francis, and I am your host of the Monday Morning Worship Leader. I am a worship leader at a mid-size Southern Baptist church in St. Louis, Missouri, and it is my pleasure to talk to you today about all things worship. I hope that you had a great Sunday yesterday. Ours was wonderful. Things went just beautifully, and we took the Lord's Supper yesterday. Always a very special time for our church. So today is going to be an extenuation of the other day when I talked to you about something that is just a great passage of Scripture, and that is Exodus 24. And so that's in the last podcast. But what I started reading, and you look at Exodus 24, there were 70 elders that were invited to stay up at the top of the mountain with God to commune with Him. On top of that, there were some other dignitaries as well. There was, of course, Moses. There was Aaron, but there were Aaron's two eldest sons, Nadab and Abihu. And in that setting, Nadab and Abihu they're right there. They see God. They are spending time with God. They're revering God. And so it's very interesting that later on we will see I won't say untimely death, because in all God's timing is perfect, but what seems to be pretty tragic death of Nadab and Abihu by the hand of God Himself. And this death occurs in Leviticus 10. Now, Leviticus 10 is a passage that describes what happens after all of the provisions of temple or tabernacle worship are given. We have these two brothers, and they're going to offer a sacrifice, an incense sacrifice to God. And so instead of following the pattern that God gave them, here's what it says, and I'm reading from the English Standard Version. This is Leviticus 10, 1 and 2. Now Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, each took his censer and put fire in it and laid incense on it and offered unauthorized fire before the Lord, which He had not commanded them. And fire came out from before the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. These two verses of Scripture has given an entire philosophy of worship a thrust, and that is known as the regulative principle of worship. What is not in Scripture is forbidden.
Quod scriptura non iubet vetat.
That's the concept, that is the idea behind the regulative principle of worship. And it is opposed by the normative principle of worship, which basically states that what is not forbidden in Scripture is permitted. And when we see the normative principle of worship, oh, by the way, I do have a podcast on this as well.
That's episode 14.
When we see the normative principle of worship in its full swing, we have chanting, we have incense, we have different holy days revered, just all sorts of things that perhaps is not in Scripture, crossing yourself, genuflecting, those kind of things which are not shown to be part of New Testament worship. And we have to understand that the regulative principle actually focuses very tightly on New Testament worship. But the deal is that while this is very noble, and in some ways I am very much a regulative principle person myself, we also see that the New Testament is somewhat quiet about what takes place in corporate worship. And so, there's a lot of research about this, and people simply want to do the right thing. And by the way, this concept of regulative principled worship comes really out of the Presbyterian Reformed movement that happened, especially in the 17th century. And looking back to the 1644 Westminster Directory of Public Worship, that particular document really lays out, right there in its preface, it lays out a regulative principle of worship that all should follow. Now, they followed it to the letter and only singing psalms and not hymns, those kind of things. They really wanted to follow it to the letter. But the problem with following the regulative principle, that anybody will tell you, this isn't a bias. The problem with following it to the letter is at some point, because we're 21st century Christians, we come to the end of it. We can no longer, and it also becomes one of those things where, our church is more regulative principle than your church, and it's just, it's kind of like conservatism in a lot of ways, where we're more conservative than you. You're not conservative because you're not as conservative as we are. You're not as regulative principled as we are, so you're not regulative principled. And let's face it, until we start walking to church with no air conditioning in the church, and we remove the hymnals, we remove everything, then we can say that. Or we remove the instrumentation, we remove all of that, we can say that, but not until then. So that is a conundrum. But there is a great article that was written some time ago by Michael Farley, and it's called "What is Biblical Worship?" This is out of the Journal for the Evangelical Theological Society, and it was written in September 2008. What is biblical worship? And in this, Professor Farley really looks at the regulative principle, but I love how he breaks it down, and I wanted to break that down for you as well today, because if we look at it this way, I think that there is a way that we can follow the regulative principle and yet have the freedom to worship in such a way that we can really look at ourselves as free worshipers. So the first thing that he does is he describes what I had just finished describing, which he calls praxis-oriented regulative principle. And that is, everything is focused, every bit of your practice is focused on the New Testament. Everything must come straight from the New Testament if it is done in Scripture or in worship. And so that is very hard to do. And I don't even know that style of worship itself is prescribed in Scripture, if that makes sense. But what Farley talks about that I really like is he talks about the theologically oriented regulative principle. Now, this points us a little bit differently. This points us in a direction of you can do this in worship if it points to Scripture. That's the difference. Not that it's commanded in Scripture, but that it points to Scripture. And what he uses to defend this are different liturgies that seem to be man-made, but they're liturgies nonetheless. Christmas, which, remember, Christmas is not, that actual event is not described as a worship time in Scripture. Advent, all of these things. But if they point to Scripture. In other words, if it doesn't point to Scripture directly, then this would be more of a normative practice, if that makes sense. So in this, the theologically oriented regulative principle does it, and it's a hermeneutical approach. In other words, it takes the Scripture and it opens it up for revelation and understanding, that we evaluate these biblical truths in ritual and symbol, And so when we look at this, we can celebrate Christmas, Easter. We can have prayers that are written out. We can do readings. We can do these kind of things because it all points back to Scripture. And if it all points back to Scripture, we can honestly say that this is a product of the regulative principle. Well, I hope that you understand a little bit more about the regulative principle, that it's something Nadab and Abihu unfortunately gave their lives for us to understand about worship, and the fact that while the regulative principle itself is a very strong standard and one that is worthy of living by in our worship, we can do it in such a way as we can have these man-made liturgies. We can have these things as long as they point us to Scripture ultimately. And when I say that, point us to, and I would say point directly to Scripture. And this would cancel out things like incense, for instance, which, I mean, yes, they did use incense in the Old Testament, but does it really point us to the scriptural truths of the gospel? And so that's what we have to look at when we look at the regulative principle. Wow, I've given you many words, but I hope you find them to be good words. Well, today's good word, I'm just going to let you in on the 1644 Westminster Directory of Public Worship. This is a PDF document that is made available, and I have it in the show notes. You'll get to see how our forebears actually worshipped and what they prescribed in their worship. And that would have been followed up by the 1689 Second London Baptist Confession of Worship. You know what? I'm going to put a link to that too in the show notes so you can see that as well. Well, I hope you've enjoyed the program today. It's a little heady, but I hope that as you think about your worship, that everything that you do in your planning toward worship is theologically oriented. And if you do that, it's going to be very well principled. Just remember, my friends, we are not rock stars. We are servants. God bless you. We've been spending a lot of time on theology and worship. Now I'm going to go to something practical. We have headhunters. Let's talk about that.
Next time on the podcast.